Before we get to today's show, we have a request. If you like this podcast, go like us, rate us on whatever podcast platform you're listening to, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, whatever it is. Go give us a good rating, and we will love you even more if you write us a great review. Another thing to be looking forward to is after this season on war, we've got a new season in the works. We're going to swerve. We're going to go in the opposite direction. Instead of war, we're going to do a season on love. Brotherly love, romantic love, Christian love, familial love. So that's what to look forward to. And now, without further delay, on with today's show. One blood demands one right. Only when the Reich borders include the very last German, but can no longer guarantee his daily bread, will the moral right to acquire foreign soil arise from the distress of our own people. Their sword will become our plow, and from the tears of war, the daily bread of generations will grow. Those infamous words are from the opening of Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. Welcome to Hot Takes on the Classics, a gossipy gallop through the best books ever written. Emily, I already feel strange about calling Mein Kampf one of the best books ever written, but we'll go on. My name is Tim McIntosh, and I am joined by Emily Maeda, and you have joined us for our season on war. Emily. Ooh.
Dun, 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 dun.
I know. This book to me feels like it's almost like you feel like you're going to get a virus on your hands even by holding a copy of the book, right?
Exactly. Exactly. It's actually one of the problems. Yeah, I know our little opening best books ever written. Yeah, not the best book ever written.
But among the most influential. Yeah.
Yeah. And let me tell you, it is not well written. He's a terrible writer. It's a pain. It's painful to read his writing.
So there's a real difference because he was, whatever we think, he was an effective orator, like a tremendously effective orator.
Exactly.
I'm already editing my words because I don't want to say a good orator. I just want to say a powerful and effective orator.
Yes.
And there's a breakdown between his written prose and his spoken prose.
Yes. And he's actually really clear about which we're going to get into. He's very clear about how he is using his oratory and the motivation and the outcome that is wanted. And he does get that outcome. Yeah, I was trying to think, is there a more infamous book within our world right now? I mean, maybe in previous ages there was another one, but is there a more infamous book than Mein Kampf?
That's a great question.
Can you think of one that is more infamous?
In our day, I can't. Would Machiavelli's The Prince be
maybe
as infamous back in the day?
I don't know. Do you even think that would have been as infamous as Mein Kampf? I don't think so.
Probably not, especially because this was during a time before really high literacy rates was The Prince.
Yes.
And so it was only nobility that would be reading it.
Right.
So there wouldn't be a broad splash across the populace. There'd be a broad splash across the oligarchs, the aristocracy, etc.
Yeah. And they disagreed with him. But, there's also something in Machiavelli, which is the reason it's kind of stood the test of time, where people are like, yeah, that's kind of true.
Yeah, right. I don't want to admit it, but hey, he's got a point.
Yeah, I know it kind of works that way. Yeah, I can't think, and honestly, I'm glad we're doing Mein Kampf because I think one of the problematic things with Hitler, fascism, Mein Kampf, it gets thrown around as a slur, right? Anybody who disagrees with you is Hitler or a fascist.
Yeah.
And part of the problem is nobody actually reads what he said, right? And so because it's almost so tainted that if you buy a copy, and in fact, part of the reason that I know this book well, sadly, is that I teach it. And when I first ordered a copy for my students to read, I mistakenly ordered a copy put out by neo-Nazis in the U.S. because there are scholarly editions.
No.
Yeah. So I burned that book. I literally burned it.
Hey.
But then
in keeping with the Nazi tradition, I guess.
I guess so. But then I did order a scholarly version. But one of the things that happens is if somebody is so vilified that you don't deal with what they think, you're doing the same thing that they were doing in reverse, right? So in order to understand fascism, you actually have to read what the fascists wrote. And I think that's what we're going to be exploring today. And part of the reason that he joined our season on war is Hitler. I can't think of anybody else we read. Tell me if I'm not thinking, but Hitler loves war.
Yeah.
Hitler loves it. He thinks it's the highest expression of human society is war. So we have to give kind of the, there is no complexity here. There is no sort of dealing with, not the brilliance, but the bravery that war calls forth, the ennoblement of like the human spirit to be courageous, but also a recognition of the pain, the suffering, the horrendous human cost that comes from war. None of that. It is one-toned, and it is war is the like highest expression of civilization. If you are not a warlike civilization, you do not deserve to exist.
It's kind of the Spartans, but not sophisticated. The Spartans had a whatever you think about putting 7-year-old boys in dorms so they could learn the military lifestyle, right? You might object to that, and fairly. They're a warlike community. They're a community that was intent on defending its borders, expanding its borders through military might. But there was a relatively rich account of life behind that militaristic outlook. And what you're telling us is that no such sophistication, no such subtlety in Mein Kampf.
Exactly. We had a visit to our community last year from Tracy Lee Simmons. Do you know Tracy Lee Simmons?
No.
He's the man who wrote Climbing Parnassus. He's, a leading thinker in classical education. It was a defense of studying Latin. And in this address, Tracy Lee Simmons talked about the hallmarks of a liberally educated student. And one of the hallmarks of a liberally educated student is that student is more moved by philosophy than ideology. And I thought, ooh, that is such a good hallmark. And that is exactly what Hitler is not. Hitler is one-toned, and it's all about ideology.
Yeah.
This is a personal account from my own family. I was trying to think if there's a name more infamous than Hitler. I don't think that there's a name more infamous than Hitler in the modern era. Do you?
Stalin maybe should be, but I don't think.
It's not.
Yeah, right.
He's just like, for everybody, he's the embodiment of evil.
Yeah.
My father was born in 1935, and his middle name was Adolf. I finally have realized, a grandfather. We couldn't figure out. But 1935, right? My dad was ashamed of his name his entire life, and in his 50s changed his middle name legally because
really
he could not handle having, it was this
understandably
weight that he bore for years. So
your parents named you Adolf. Tell us about that family history. Yeah,
yes.
You're automatically starting on the defensive. Change it. I think that's a good move.
Yeah, he refused. He was Richard A. Roberts, refused to give his middle name until he changed his middle name to Andrew.
Well done.
So,
okay. Yeah.
Anyway, let's get on to this book. So, interestingly enough, and it just dawned on me, we are now in 2025, and this is the 100th year anniversary of the publication of Mein Kampf. So,
yeah, what do you do with that?
A date that shall live in infamy, right?
Yeah.
100 years on, let's think about the impact this book has had. So before we get into that, we should talk a little bit about who Hitler was, because I think one of the dangers, it's just what I said before, one of the dangers in vilifying somebody so much, it's like, oh, well, they're beyond our human experience. Hitler's so evil that he's basically not a person.
Yeah.
No, he was a person, and you can't get out. You have to deal with who he was rather than just tar and feathering him.
Hey, before we get into this, I have a question for you. When I think the History Channel, let's imagine a month when their ratings are flagging. I've got an idea. Since we can't do Shark Week, let's do a biopic on Hitler, or let's do a documentary on the Nazis or whatever like that. And it's a crowd favorite. People will flock to it.
Yes.
And I've always wondered, and I'm one of those people, I will, if I see like Nazis or Hitler, I'll be like, that guy, that sounds interesting. And I think about why that's the case. And I wonder if you have a theory about why that's the case. Is it because I want to feel a little bit better about myself? Like, well, I may have kicked a puppy on the way home, but I'm not Adolf Hitler. Do you think that's what it is?
I mean, I think that there's a fascination. And just rereading Mein Kampf, you see like this complete devotion to something that is so anti the underpinnings of our society, right? The bold-faced affirmation of killing anybody who is weak or defective. He says it straight out. I think there's a fascination with that breaking utterly of the norms, don't you?
Yeah.
And I do think that it does make us feel better about ourselves, because we think, I could ever have elected Hitler. Could they have done it, right? Righteous indignation.
Right.
It incites righteous indignation without thinking about the complexity of where Hitler came from and who he appealed to.
I do sometimes wonder if some people watch a Hitler biography documentary and they're looking to make sure that they don't have any of the marks themselves.
Yeah. Yep.
That might be like another explanation.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Speaking of that, our favorite history podcast, The Rest is History, guess what they start every New Year with?
What do they start with?
An episode on Nazis.
Do they really?
They sure do.
Shark Week on, I mean, it is the equivalent of Shark Week.
It totally is. Because you can't believe the carnage. I mean, one of the things that's really disturbing is in this last election cycle, I heard some crazy things about pundits like, oh, Hitler didn't really mean to kill all the Jews. I'm like, that's
Wait, what?
Oh, yeah. And we shouldn't go down these rabbit holes, but in certain dark corners, not even that dark corners of the internet, these discussions among groups of like, the U.S. shouldn't have gotten involved in World War II. Hitler wasn't so bad. He wasn't really trying to kill all the Jews. That wasn't his intent. And if you read Mein Kampf, you can never say that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing is, people often say in the lead up to World War II, but nobody had any idea what Hitler was going to do. Wrong. That is indefensible. If you read his words, you would know what he was going to do. In a similar way that people talk about Putin now. Well, Putin was kind of forced into invading Ukraine. No, read what Putin said, and he's very clear about what he's doing.
He's got a plan.
Yeah. So, are we ready to get into his background?
I think so.
Now, one of the things, too, and I also say this to my students, Hitler is not wrong about everything. He perceives some actual problems, and he is able to name some actual problems. And just because somebody's able to name problems and isn't wrong about everything doesn't mean anything they say is legit. Right?
Right.
But also in that emphasis to like discredit Hitler, we go too far. And then once again, he's not a real human being, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But his analysis of the economic situation in Germany after World War I is an instance that it's like, yes, that is an accurate description of what is going on and of the environment that created like the kind of matchstick that was Europe before World War II.
Absolutely. Okay, so Hitler is born in Austria in 1889. This is always a big deal for him because he actually wasn't born in the motherland, but he relates that he felt from the earliest age a great connection to the land of Germany. And he remembers singing Deutsches über alles, Germany over all, and feeling his heart swell with pride at being a German. So he relates this from his youth. But he is not a promising youth. He is not super intelligent. He doesn't set himself apart in school. His father is a civil servant and wants him to become a civil servant also in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Hitler is clear that he will never do that. But he is not smart enough. Germany has a 2-tiered education system. And if you are promising, you go to the gymnasium, which is essentially a classical education, right? It's a liberal arts education. But if you're not, you go into trade schools. And he did not make it into gymnasium. And both he and his father said, why would I want all that book learning? That's ridiculous. I don't need that book learning. So we'll come back to, remember Clausewitz? Remember how you said because he was outside the system, it somehow gave him an insight?
Right. And you did not buy my argument.
I didn't. But
and you're not going to buy it with Hitler either, apparently.
Here we got another one. So then, he's kind of aimless and he gets out of school and he decides he's going to go to Vienna and become an art student. And whenever my students are reading this, everybody has the same response because he applies, I think, 3 times. And everybody says, just let him into art school.
Right.
Just let him in.
If they'd only known.
Yes.
Would it be so hard to avert a second world war by just lowering your standards a little bit?
Couldn't you see what he was going to do? My God, let him in. Yeah, no, but seriously, you sort of get this feeling like maybe he could have just been a second-rate artist and that would have fulfilled this, passionate temperament that he had, but no such luck. So then he's kind of a drifter in Vienna. And Vienna is the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the Austrian side. We'll talk about the Austro-Hungarian Empire in a minute. And he is there and he's kind of doing graphic design. He's using his art skills, but not really for anything. And when you read the account, he's lonely. He's living in nasty places. He is a guy that both you and I know. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
He is the picture of the young, disaffected male who doesn't have a sense of where he belongs, isn't super talented at things. When The Rest is History did a recent podcast on JFK, that's how they described Lee Harvey Oswald. And we know this kind of a kid. Yeah. And he's ripe for being sort of radicalized. And he gets radicalized. He comes under the sway of the pan-German movement, which is we need to bring the Germans together. We need to expand Germany, all of these things. And he starts reading anti-Semitic documents, and he is essentially radicalized.
And anti-Semitism at the time is not a, how would I say it?
Right.
There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the mind. Yeah, right.
This is prevalent. Not hard to find. It's pretty mainstream, in fact. Right.
And so there are some popularizers or some sort of pseudo-intellectual treatments like justifying anti-Semitism at the time.
Exactly.
He reads some of this stuff and he's like, oh, I always knew it. It's that group of people.
That's what it is. Yeah. That's those guys. It's the Jews. And so the Jews take on, when you read Mein Kampf, it is not logical and it is not consistent. So the Jews are both the runners of all business and then also all the Marxists, right? Those are two mutually opposed groups. But the Jews are everywhere. Everything that is bad, it is the Jews. So this really helps him sort of bring together his thinking. So he is, and part of what radicalizes him is he attends the Austrian Parliament and he cannot handle what he sees. So what is the Austro-Hungarian Empire? We kind of have to talk about it because it does make a difference to Hitler's formation. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's the remnants of sort of a bunch of different empires, mainly the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg family, but also the Hungarian Empire. There's a whole lot of history in Central and Eastern Europe that most Americans know nothing of. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is one of those things. So it starts in 1867, and it's a bringing together of the dual monarchies of Austria, which are the Habsburgs, and Hungary. And they're underneath the emperor, who is Austrian, And the emperor takes care of foreign policy, economic policy, the military. And the emperor has full power, but Emperor Franz Joseph, he operated like a constitutional monarch. So he had advisors and ministers. And then Austria and Hungary each had their own parliaments where they handled everything else outside of those things. So in the Austrian parliament, there are Czechs, there are Poles, there are Slovaks, there's Serbs, there's Croats, there's Italians, there's Romanians. And so one of the things that Hitler experiences when he goes to the parliament is chaos. That's how are all these people communicating, right? And at this time, there's growing nationalism. So you'll read about it in accounts of the Austrian parliament. The Czechs stand up and they refuse to speak in German. They're speaking in Czech. And then the Serbs stand up and they refuse to speak in German. They're speaking in Serbo-Croat, right? So everybody's sort of asserting the primacy of their own language. And Hitler says, we've lost our minds. We've lost our minds.
Right.
German is clearly the best language. The Germans are clearly the most advanced. The Germans are too easy on all of these dumb groups, and we just need to assert our power and authority. And Germany is always being kicked, always down. It's always being, mistreated, and it burns him. So
you can see all the seeds being planted, can't you?
I know.
You're like, oh, that one's going to grow into this like really dark, poisonous fruit.
Exactly. And you understand it because I'm sure when you go to a foreign country, you've had this experience where it is unsettling when you cannot understand what's going on around you, right?
Yeah.
And don't you sometimes, you can sort of, if you're not careful, develop a suspicious edge like they're speaking about me. You know what I mean? You just see how this arises.
Yeah.
And this is it on steroids. So Hitler is totally critical of parliamentary democracy and he's not totally wrong. Like in this time, parliamentary democracy is really on the ropes because it doesn't seem like it's dealing with the economic fallout, the nationalistic uprisings, the difficulties both before and after the war. Parliamentary democracy seems pretty impotent because it's not really doing anything because it's slow. It's really hard to bring people together.
Yeah.
So he's completely critical of this. And, here's the funny thing. I just finished reading Sleepwalkers. Can't remember the historian's name. I'll find it in a minute. But it's about the lead up to World War I. And the guy makes the point, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as empires go, was really pretty good. Like they gave their individual constituent ethnic groups lots of self-determination.
Really?
They were really pretty great about empowering people to lead from their own country, So, but all of that Hitler senses as weakness and an inability to assert the supremacy of the German people.
And I'm hearing this and I'm thinking, okay, all we need now is some sort of like terrible circumstances within the nation, dire circumstances. And then he'll have the voice of the strong man able to articulate all of his disgruntlement, all of our disgruntlement. All we need is some bad circumstances.
Dun, 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 dun. You are right.
Right.
You are right. And those bad circumstances are
the financial situation caused by the settlement of World War I.
Yeah. So before we jump to that, though, the war comes. And Hitler is the only account that I have read in which he says this. The struggle of the year 1914 was not forced on the masses. No, by the living God, it was desired by the whole people. Even today, I am not ashamed to say that, overpowered by my stormy enthusiasm, I fell down on my knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live at this time. Who says that? This is at the Declaration of War in 1914. So, like so many other foolish young men who see war as this amazing opportunity, right? I have never heard anybody say that. And this is even in retrospect after what happened in the war, right? Hitler is writing this in 1923. Like, he knows the outcome of what's going to happen, and he still says this.
Goodness. He does love war.
Oh, he loves it. He loves it. Yeah, and he recognizes that now we are going to get rid of the sham of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He says he is a full-blown nationalist. And Hitler actually is really helpful because he describes what's different between nationalism and what's different between patriotism. And he says he's not a patriot because patriotism is located within a fealty to a person. He's a nationalist. Don't give me any of this monarchical nonsense. It's in the blood. It's in the blood. He's always talking about the blood. It's in the blood.
Do we know where that comes from? Is that kind of like left? I associate the romantic movement, capital R romantic movement, with this kind of sense of like our language is the defining feature of our people. And sometimes the romantics have this notion that, and French blood itself is that, that makes us different. We are superior for that reason. So do you think that's where he gets some of that idea?
Oh, completely. I mean, one thing that we should mention, which is he is such a hodgepodge of bizarre, influences and coming together of ideas. But social Darwinism is huge for Hitler, right? Survival of the fittest. Struggle is what determines your outcome. And social Darwinism also couples with racial theory that's growing at the time. This is the time when people are doing phrenology, like measuring the skull, because you can measure the skull and tell who's the smartest. Yeah. And this is the beginning of the three races, Mongoloid, Aryan, and Negroid, right? All of this racial theory is developing at the same time, and it's very scientific. And
quotes around the scientific.
Scientific, right. Yeah. But this is leading scientific thought at the time, and it's proving that Western societies and races are superior to the rest of the world. I mean, that is the whole aim. And social Darwinism, which is Hitler's lifeblood. But it's also coupled with then this very mystical and romantic sense of the goodness of the people, of the land. So hard to decipher which is which, but it's in the blood, and it's in the people, and it's in the folk, right? It's such a toxic mixture of ideas.
But again, I keep looking forward a little bit. If you're the German people and you've been suffering under the supposed peace settlement that debilitated you after World War I, you are not even convinced that you lost World War I.
Yeah.
Right? Like a lot of Germans are like, we didn't even lose the war. We didn't even lose the war. We were kind of like forced to the table. We still had plenty of troops on the field, et cetera, et cetera.
Not true.
And you go into this really dark cultural cave after World War I, and then you start hearing this guy talking about what an incredible people we are just by having this blood in our veins, by speaking this language, by being within these borders. We are a great people destined for greatness. If you've been living in that dark cave for a while and you want to come out into the light, that looks like light to you.
Yeah, and it's the thing about Hitler's rise is that people think he's crazy. In Germany, people do think he's crazy, but then they see that he gets results and they're like, okay, well, he's a little crazy about some of this stuff, but we agree with him on X, Y, and Z. So let's just use him, right? And we'll make a coalition with him and we will use him, and he's going to go too far, right? That's what they all think. He's going to go too far and we'll be able to control him. And, the laugh is on them. But you're right. He taps into that sense of shame that was so toxic in the settlement. Like, is there a worse settlement from a war than the Treaty of Versailles?
I think the answer is no.
Yes.
I think
you're going to have to add which American president voted up. Say it, Tim.
So, listeners, can I just give you, before I say it, and I will say it, before you should just know that Emily and I have had an ongoing debate since the beginning of our friendship almost over President Woodrow Wilson.
We sure have.
Woodrow Wilson was president during World War I, and he was present during the Treaty of Versailles. And Emily and I disagree about, she gives him a lot more of the shame and guilt because of what happened at the Treaty of Versailles.
For what he allowed.
From what he allowed. My defense is he was trying to control the Brits and the French, who their leadership at the time were so beyond incensed at what they perceived had been done to them that Wilson was just trying to kind of corral them. And my interpretation is that the perception that Wilson was the most powerful guy in the room by far, I think, is a misnomer. So that's what we're laughing at. That's what we're laughing at. I
give that to you. But there is no doubt that the war guilt clause was one of the most foolish things that could have ever been put into a settlement, and it destroyed Germany.
And say more about what that was, Emily. Say more about that.
The war guilt clause, I can't remember the exact heading of it, but it said that Germany accepted all the responsibility for World War I and that it was their fault that it had happened, which is not true. And Sleepwalkers is a great book if you want to find out more the complexity of what happened at the beginning of World War I.
And they were not allowed. There were severe economic penalties, and they were not allowed to convene their own military.
Exactly.
They did, but they were doing it kind of like under cloak.
Well, and Hitler supercharged that once he took power.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, that was so foolish that it was the grounds, because the war guilt clause functions as a central point of anger in Mein Kampf. Like, we were not the ones at fault. And it's true. The complexities of World War I were far too deep to put it all in Germany. It just isn't fair. So let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to find out what Hitler hates. And I'm going to give you a little secret. He hates everything.
Hey, listen, everybody. This podcast is platformed by Classical Academic Press, and we are delighted that they do platform us. Listen, if you are in any way part of the classical education community, or even if you're just curious about the classical education movement, go to classicalacademicpress.com or check out Classical U. That's just the letter U, not YOU.com. There's so many great books there, so many resources. Emily will go and just kind of like scroll through their latest offerings on Classical U, and I think, I want to check that one out when I get time. So if you do and you make a purchase, please use our coupon and get 10% off. Just type into the exit coupon code Hot Takes, all one word, all lowercase. Actually, it's not case sensitive, and get a 10% discount. It'd be a great way to not only support the show, but to support the growing classical education movement. Emily, with that, back to this not great but influential book, Mein Kampf.
So you have read, Mein Kampf literally means my struggle. And for Hitler, struggle, because of his belief in social Darwinism, struggle defines everything in our existence. And if you are not struggling, you are not really alive. And if you were not asserting your will, what are you? So Hitler really sees himself as the Übermensch, which he's taking from Nietzsche. And I think that there's no way around it. He's taking it from Nietzsche. And he is going to lead the Germans out of their racial bondage, because the main problem with the Germans, as Hitler sees it, is that their blood has been polluted. And he is going to lead them into the light of glorious world domination. So he is carrying out the ideas of social Darwinism to their logical conclusion, and it's really scary.
Emily, the difference between social Darwinism and Darwinism. I mean, Darwinism, the kind of shorthand version of it is species survive and adapt, but their number one job is to survive through carving out their own...
Survival of the fittest.
Right. And so what we get in current species is kind of an advanced or an evolved species because it has survived in competition with other like species for grain, territory, etc. Social Darwinism, how is it different?
Social Darwinism is that thinking applied to human beings, right? So human beings are looking at that, as Darwin was looking at the natural world and saying, this is what we see in species. But if you're thinking from a species standpoint, well, we're a species too.
And so the social Darwinists are just saying like, hey, let's take the white gloves off and just admit what we are. We're just another species.
We're just another species.
Fighting for survival ourselves.
And so if that happens in the natural world, well, then why doesn't it happen with human beings?
Yeah.
The only argument against this is that human beings carry a dignity given to them this by God, that they carry the imago Dei. And because of that, nothing that you do either increases or decreases your worth. But Hitler's like, that's ridiculous. No, somebody who's smart is worth more than the child who has Down syndrome. And we just all need to say that that's what it is.
Don't you, this period of time, and maybe it's true of our period of time also, feels this kind of, there's a little bit of a dilemma. And the dilemma is, if I accept the kind of evolutionary account that science has given us, then I have to admit I live in this cruel, brutal, bitter world, red in tooth and claw. And that's a very hard thing to accept about human beings. And so we kind of bolt on what you just said, a kind of remnant of social Christianity, or like real Christianity, but we bolt on this idea that, no, human beings are of a different stuff. We are in the image of God. But those two joint beliefs, I think in a lot of modern people, coexist in a kind of uneasy way.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
The social Darwinists are saying like, just jettison the one. Just unbolt the whole image of God idea. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I think that is what is helpful about Hitler. He follows ideas through to their end. So, I mean, he's not going to let you sit in that sort of thing of like, oh, well, these two things, I'm not going to really think about them. He's like, no, it's one or the other. And from that standpoint, don't think you kind of have to have one or the other. You're either going to live by this one. It's just that most people don't ever follow it through. This is
part of the reason why Crime and Punishment is such an invigorating book. Now, this is written, 40 years earlier, but it's a fictional, but so realistic account of a young man's desire to kind of rise to the top of his
milieu,
by being an Übermensch. Now it's a Russian story about a young Russian man, so he doesn't think of himself as the Übermensch, but it's proto-Hitler before Hitler comes along.
Completely. And
it tears him apart. Part of the power of the book is that like really trying to live in that way, he commits a murder and it rips him in half. And he can't do it. The whole book is him trying to rectify these two sides of himself that cannot really coexist.
Yep.
And so Hitler is just choosing one of those sides.
Exactly.
And going for it all the way.
Going for it all the way. Yeah. And that's, you think of Raskolnikov, like Hitler could have been Raskolnikov, right?
Right.
Like, dreary
exactly. A failed student in many ways. Yeah.
So if Hitler is brilliant, I argue about this with my son, who's like, Hitler's brilliant. And I'm like, no, he's not. He's not even that intelligent. But if he has a brilliance, it is in understanding propaganda. And when you read his stuff on propaganda, it should give us all pause to think about what we fall under. So
really,
let me just read some of his quotes on propaganda before we get into the things that he hates, because he's super clear about how he's going to go about messaging his ideas. And if there's one thing that he does, he understands that the Nazis were really committed to like mass media, new media, film, all of these ways because they saw it as much easier ways to influence people. I mean, just, I don't think we need to go into our current situation to see how that is similar. Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to read you a few from his own words. It must always be addressed to the masses. The function of propaganda does not lie in the scientific training of the individual, but in calling the masses' attention to certain facts, processes, necessities, whose significance is placed within their field of vision. All propaganda must be popular, and its intellectual level must be adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to. The art of propaganda lies in understanding the emotional ideas of the great masses and finding, through a psychologically correct form, the way to the attention and thence to the heart of the broad masses. So he gives an example where he says, the propaganda of the Germans in World War I was totally ineffective because it made the enemy look like silly kids. But when the German soldiers actually came into contact, that's not who they were at all. And he said, much better was the American propaganda that made the Germans look awful and scary. Much better was that because it hardened the soldiers' hearts. Okay, here he's got some more.
I want to jump in, Emily. I don't want to break your train of thought, but I want to jump in. Clausewitz is one of the first. So on war, I think 3 previous episodes to this one, Clausewitz talks about how fundamental propaganda must be in a time where war is total war, when armies are not just small slivers from an upper class, but they are taken from often conscription and from the populace. He is very clear, in order to run a war like that, and that's the only kind of war there's going to be in modern Europe, you have to have powerful propaganda against your opponent to raise the hearts of the men and women who will be fighting. And Hitler, a couple, decades after Clausewitz, is also recognizing that
power of it.
Yeah.
Its task, propaganda's task, is not to make an objective study of the truth insofar as it favors the enemy, and then to set it before the masses with academic fairness. Its task is to serve our own right always and unflinchingly. The people, in their overwhelming majority, are so feminine by nature and attitude that sober reasoning determines their thoughts and actions far less than emotion and feeling. Ooh, I love that. Propaganda does not have multiple shadings. It has a positive and a negative, love or hate, right or wrong, truth or lie, never half this way and half that way, never partially, or that kind of thing. So he understands so clearly how to run people. Simple, this is part of what our students learn in a liberal arts education. That's the either or fallacy. That's a fallacy.
Right.
A liberal art education, an art for free people, or an education for free people, tries to teach you can't become fall under the influence of this. This is wrong thinking, no matter what. And Hitler's like, nobody cares. Nobody cares.
Yeah,
you're getting your idea through. The purpose of propaganda is not to provide interesting distraction for blasé young gentlemen, but to convince. And what I mean is to convince the mass. And he also says you've got to have one enemy. And that enemy, you got to go after them all the time. And here we get to what we know about Hitler.
I have to interrupt, Emily. I'm thinking about how much of our media discourse sadly really kind of fits this description.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to mention the media outlet, but a very prominent newspaper. I used to be a subscriber, and I got so tired at the end of every article. I don't mean editorial. I mean news reporting article. I could bolt on, imaginatively bolt on a postscript that said, and thus you should vote for this party.
Yes.
And I just thought,
this is not intellectually honest.
It's not intellectually honest.
Yeah.
And I think we could name names if we wanted to on both sides of the political spectrum that you could add that PS. The only thing that you would have to change is and thus vote for X party instead of Y party.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
It's so discouraging that even really, I think, deeply reputable news outlets that have a real strong legacy and reputation really feel like they are drifting into that kind of
discourse.
Angling.
Yep.
Yeah, that kind of discourse, which is not to say, I am not claiming by any means that you should not have a set of convictions behind your reporting.
Yes.
I think that the time in American history where we purported to be completely neutral, that was a relatively short amount of time. That was like a generation, maybe 2 generations, where newspapers were like, we are going to be completely independent of,
our own viewpoint,
our own political, cultural convictions. That's not like possible to do that. It doesn't mean that you stop reporting counterfactuals just because they don't suit your political program. You have to report those things.
Exactly. But I think that when he's calling it propaganda, that's what it is. And Neil Postman, in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, shows that this is what's going to happen in the next era of argument that is not built upon the prose of sort of logical argument, right? And Hitler is the first progenitor of that. Like, he's saying, no, you're dealing with emotional manipulation. The facts actually are secondary to the emotional manipulation, because the highest aim is for the blood to be pure. That's the aim that we're serving.
Yeah.
That's the aim he's serving. So anything in service of that, it doesn't need to be true. He's quite front and center with that. It doesn't need to be true. It just needs to serve the ultimate purpose. The ends completely justify the means.
Right.
He is a utilitarian to the T, right? So I start with propaganda because I do think that is where Hitler's brilliance lay. And I don't have trouble saying that. Like, he was a master of that.
Yeah.
And we should pay attention to it, because I think our own media landscape, this is on the beginning ends of like film, mass radio broadcasts, free access to newspapers. Newspapers had been around for some time, but radio and film particularly. Yeah. And the Nazis were masters of it. They were masters of these new media. And they understood that when you disassociate ideas from sort of a logical stepped through argument, you can really move people.
Yeah.
Film's really powerful. The image is really powerful. And I start with that because Mein Kampf itself is such a ridiculous jumble of so many different ideas going in so many different directions. And my students always point out a major contradiction at the heart of Mein Kampf. And it's actually a contradiction around social Darwinism, which is Hitler is always talking about survival of the fittest. The best races must survive. But then, oh my gosh, those master races are always at the mercy of these inferior races. Can't have it both ways, Hitler. Either the Jews are inferior and therefore will be run by the master race, or they're actually very strong and powerful themselves, and the master race isn't strong enough. Do you see what I mean? Like, the kids pick up on this immediately. How can you be always saying the master race, but then why is the master race always at the mercy of these evil people? Right? It doesn't make any sense.
If you were the lion, why are you having so much trouble with this? Like, with
all these lambs that are running your life.
With this lamb, yeah.
Yeah, that's basically it. If you're the Ubermensch and you're the master race, then why are you enslaved by all of these do-nothing people?
Right.
And it's very interesting. The kids always pick up on that. Like, can't have it both ways.
And the easier explanation for what's going on is Hitler has scapegoated kind of he's provided a structural scapegoat, in this case, the Jews.
Yep.
And so he's pointing everyone's ire, rage, frustration at that people group.
Yes.
Which maybe at some point in this podcast, we'll talk about the work of René Girard. This is one of the great insights, I think, of the 20th century, is that the scapegoating mechanism among groups of people.
Yes.
And Hitler is kind of masterful at scapegoating the Jews.
He understands Well, he understands mimetic desire, which is what René Girard calls it, and he understands how to manipulate it in a very deep and dark and ugly way. Okay, so let's go through what Hitler hates. Hitler hates the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
It's going to be a long list, yeah.
Oh, sure is. I was repelled by the conglomeration of races which the capital showed me, repelled by this whole mixture of Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Serbs, Croats, and everywhere. The eternal mushroom of humanity, Jews and more Jews. So for Hitler, the Jews are the lowest form of humanity because they don't have a homeland. They don't have the blood, and they're parasites on all civilizations. Hitler hates democracy, really hates it. The parliamentary principle of majority rule sins against the basic aristocratic principle in nature. Or try this one. Does anyone believe that the progress of this world springs from the mind of majorities and not from the brain of individuals? It's really rich, too, because Hitler isn't an aristocrat, nor is he even educated, but, right, he thinks he's that man.
Right, yeah.
Here's another one. And this is one of the main reasons why this type of political activity, democracy, is always repulsive to any man who is decent at heart and hence courageous, while it attracts all low characters. When leaders of a nation consist of such vile creatures, the results will soon be deplorable. Such a nation will be unable to muster the courage for any determined act. So he sees democracy as just sort of the negation of responsibility, because you're like, well, they all wanted to do it, so I guess we're going to do it. He's like, you needed somebody take the lead and to bear the shame and to,
Yeah, right.
And he's willing to do it. Okay, well, no surprise here, but Hitler hates the Jews. Let's just go through what he says. All who are not of good race in this world are chaff. Blood sin and desecration of the race are the original sin in this world and the end of humanity which surrenders to it. I bet you didn't know that the original sin is desecration of the race.
That really? I did not know that.
If the Jews were alone in this world, they would stifle in filth and offal. The Jew has always been a people with definite racial characteristics and never a religion. Only in order to get ahead, he early sought for a means which could distract unpleasant attention from his person. So, I recently read The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, and this is something that she spends a long time on. She's like, this idea that the Jews were a race, this is racial scientific theory. She's like, it's ridiculous. They were a religion. And the anti-Semitism in Europe was religiously based. It was not racial. So she disputes him on this because he wants to make it a matter, once again, of blood, right? So even if you are not a practicing Jew, it doesn't matter. You're tainted by your blood, right? Because there were many of Jewish origin in Germany who were not practicing Jews. And
he had to have an explanation for why they were still part of the problem.
Yes, because it's a desecration of the blood.
Yeah.
And Hannah Arendt, her argument is so airtight and strong. And she says, because she's disputing this whole idea of race. I mean, it's one of the things that we should really be careful of, because we actually, a lot of us still play under those systems of division, right? Like, no, it's all terribly disproved scientific theory. Like, it holds no water at all.
Yeah.
Okay. But here, too, there must be no half measures. The gravest and most ruthless decisions will have to be made. It is a half measure to let incurable sick people contaminate the remaining healthy ones. This is in keeping with the humanitarianism, which, to avoid hurting one individual, lets 100 others perish. The demand that defective people be prevented from propagating equally defective offspring is a demand of the clearest reason, and if systematically executed, represents the most humane act of mankind. So here we have turned the whole basis of Western culture on its head, which brings from Christianity, that you do nothing within yourself to gain your worth. You are worthy because you bear the image of God. Turns it all on its head. And he says, no, that's not humanitarian at all. And, in here, he is echoing Nietzsche, who says, those Christians, they just support the weak, the the defective, those who can't really do anything, right? I mean, that's Nietzsche's beef with...
they're a slave class.
Yeah.
And they're kind of they're biting at the heels of the overclass, the overmen.
Yeah.
There's a long debate about whether or not we think that Nietzsche was a powerful influence on Hitler. In some ways, it can't be denied.
It can't be denied.
But
I don't think he was smart enough to read Nietzsche, but like the idea.
Right.
And
yeah.
The downstream idea of Nietzsche. Okay, Hitler hates peace. Mankind has grown great in eternal struggle, and only in eternal peace does it perish. Who has ever said that?
Wow.
Who has ever said that? Then, though, in a very different future, there will be but two possibilities. Either the world will be governed according to the idea of modern democracy, and then the weight of any decision will result in favor of the numerically stronger races of the world, or the world will be dominated in accordance with the laws of the natural order of force, and then it is the peoples of brutal will who will conquer. Shall I keep
Adolf.
going on?
The point is very strongly made. It is. It's hard to argue that Adolf Hitler was anyone other than Adolf Hitler based on his book. Meaning, like, it's hard to say Hitler got a bad reputation, but a lot of that is It's hard to read. It's hard to accept that at all.
It is. And
based on his book.
This is only a small portion of this ridiculously long book that makes you want to go nuts reading it, because he can't follow thoughts through. He jumps all over the place. He's a terrible writer. He needed an editor. Thank God he didn't get one.
I've never taught Mein Kampf. How do your students respond when you assign it to them and when they begin reading it?
Well, we used to read the entire thing, and then I just decided that is far too much of this substandard book. I cannot handle it. So they are just, it is shocking to read it so clearly laid out in, type on a paper that people read, that they're just, they despise Hitler, but they do understand more how people fell for him.
Yeah.
But, I haven't even, it's amazing when you think about the lead up to World War II, and I get Europe because Europe had been traumatized by World War I. But Hitler in here is we haven't even gotten to his part where he says, we're going to conquer Europe because we need more space for the Germans because we are the master race. He's very clear. We need more space, and we're not going to go about it any other way except by getting more land connected to Germany.
Yeah.
Right? So when he goes into Czechoslovakia and Chamberlain's like, okay, let's just give him Czechoslovakia. Like, no, why did you do that? Because you should have read the book. He's telling you what he's going to do. And then when somebody says, oh, but he didn't really mean to kill all the Jews. No. He says it so clearly. Should I read you this part? He says, the only way that you get rid of inferior ideas or inferior people is to destroy them.
Oh my goodness.
You cannot leave a remnant, because if you leave a remnant, people will feel bad for the remnant and then it'll turn back on you. You must destroy them completely. And that's the final solution. That is what he was setting about to do. He was going to rid the world of any Jewish person. Right? And
Emily,
you just can't say people didn't know. People knew.
Do you think, let's go back to Chamberlain. So Chamberlain, British Prime Minister between World War I and World War II, famously takes a meeting with Hitler, returns to the meeting, says that we have achieved peace in our time, and he just says, we're not going to deal with Hitler. We're going to just take a hands-off approach. Hitler's going to respect our wishes. And of course, that's the exact opposite of what happens. I look at Chamberlain, he's become a byword for weak leadership, for not recognizing that you've got a tiger underneath the dining room table. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's more complicated than that, because Chamberlain, but I think this is the thing, is that I think Chamberlain underestimated Hitler because I think Chamberlain thought he was smarter than Hitler, which he probably was.
Right.
But he
thought that he could control him.
He did.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? Where if he had looked a little bit more at what Hitler's motivations were, like, why didn't Chamberlain have somebody read Mein Kampf and give him the notes? And that, because it's laid out here. He says what he's going to do, right?
So maybe he thought like the other British aristocrats and parliamentary officials would control him. Maybe that was some of the thinking. I don't know enough about Chamberlain's mindset.
But I just think that Chamberlain thought he was smarter and thought that this, kind of crazy, extreme German, like, wouldn't really follow through, wouldn't really do what he said he was going to do. Because Hitler also, in public, manipulated the public and said, oh, no, I have no thoughts of war. We just want to protect our people, right?
Of course.
Because he's not trying to be truthful. The truth doesn't exist for Hitler. There's nothing, there are no transcendent realities that apply to him, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's very clear. Some of the stuff from the Hitler Youth Program, he had them sing these songs that were essentially hymns to Christ, except Hitler was put.
Oh.
Like, our Führer is the savior of us. He saves us from da-da-da-da. I mean, Hitler saw nothing. The highest good was racial purity. That was the highest good. And anything that served that purpose. So to see him as just like trying to get land, like, no, he had a whole program and he was carrying it out. Right? He was carrying it out. He was going to do what he said he was going to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Emily, I'm dying to know what your hot take is. What rabbit are you going to pull out of this?
Well, when I read Hitler, and I think this all the time, and I don't think that I don't want to be so foolish as to think that this would actually have solved the problem, but I do think that his formation was so poor that part of Hitler is he's a malformed individual who should have had a classical education at all times and in all places. In Mein Kampf, he cares nothing for truth. He cares nothing for truth. He cares nothing for the beautiful. He says over and over again in the propaganda section, no, we're dispensing with beauty. Like, that's ridiculous. Hitler is all so much of one note. Like, it shows what happens when somebody becomes ruled by ideology, right? He sees nothing but this, and ideology gets smacked onto all of reality, and therefore reality can never break through to you, the goodness of reality. And his thinking is so poor. So this is why I argue with my son, who was like, no, Hitler was brilliant. And I say, no, he wasn't. He was foolish. And actually, when you look back on some of his wins, like, he has, I don't know why it happened for him, but kind of these miraculous things turn around. He has great foreign policy achievements, and kind of unbelievably, and he kind of thinks it's him.
Yeah, right.
But like, he was a fool. He should never have invaded the Soviet Union. He shouldn't have tried to take on all of Europe. Like, he should have done it in a better way if he was really, hell-bent on this.
Tactically savvy.
Yeah. So what do you think? Do you think Hitler was intelligent? I don't think he's intelligent. I think he is not intelligent. Doesn't mean he doesn't have certain brilliances. But
yeah, I think his oratory skills they're so powerful that I can't think that he was just a complete knucklehead. Like, if you're going to move that many people through what you say, and you're going to whip them into a frenzy. Yeah. I do think that requires some intelligence. And I want to be clear to our listeners, I think neither Emily nor I think that intelligence is a moral category.
Exactly. It's not a moral category.
Calculating category, and it can be linked or unlinked to virtues and goodness. So to call somebody intelligent is, you can just state a fact. It's no great laud.
No great laud.
So I might have a little bit higher estimation of his intelligence than you do, but I don't think he was.
Yeah, I mean the book. Pause. Aside from the content, which is horrifying, the writing is just ridiculous. And, tactically, when you look at how he plays out World War II, he was too enamored with himself. Like, he was a fool in the way he prosecuted the war.
He thought that he could do anything.
He did.
Yeah.
He fell prey to the Übermensch philosophy. Yeah.
Emily, what's your hot take?
He should have had a classical education. But I will say another hot take, and I do think this is a little bit of a hot take, is that Mein Kampf should be required reading. We can't allow somebody to be so tarred and feathered that they sit outside of discourse where people can throw around Hitler as a boogeyman without knowing what he said. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
I think it's very dangerous. And then Mein Kampf...
He becomes sort of inhuman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not as a warning. Like, watch out when people are talking about propaganda this way. Watch out when they refuse to give both sides, when they're intellectually dishonest. Watch out. Like, don't fall prey to that. But if Hitler just remains somebody who's not the name that shall not be spoken, then people are free to use him in whatever way they want.
Right. Assign him to anything that they just want to vilify.
Exactly. But he is a real warning. I mean, I think Tom Holland on one of the Rest of History podcasts said, Hitler is the embodiment of anti-Christian thinking. And I think he's very right in that. Like, this is, if you don't sort of you can't, what you said, the two that exist, this sort of social Darwinism, along with this idea of like a image of God, they don't coexist. They're opposed to one another. And Hitler did us the favor of showing what a society looks like if you dispense with the image of God. Yeah. It looks like Nazi Germany.
Yeah. Emily, let's do rapid fire.
I think my rapid fire are dumb, but I'm just going to give them to you. Hitler or Stalin? I see.
That's not dumb. It's an unanswerable dilemma.
It is an unanswerable dilemma.
I think if we're calling it by strict body count, which is a terrible rubric for evaluating, Stalin was worse.
I agree. And it really ticks me off that he gets off and is now being rehabilitated.
What? He's not being rehabilitated.
Totally. Vladimir Putin is totally rehabilitating Stalin. Really chaps my hide. Okay. Parliamentary democracy or fascism. How about that?
Wait. Parliamentary democracy. Who would not choose parliamentary democracy?
Well, I'm just making sure.
Oh, okay. Oh, it was more of a test of my of my character. I see.
But I say that because at this time, it really was a valid question. What was going to win out? I mean, parliamentary democracy did not look like it was going to be winning out. It looked really problematic. Okay. How about Austro-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire? Which one are you going to choose?
Which old man of Europe? Is that which of the old men? I choose the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Interesting.
Did you choose the Ottoman Empire?
No, I don't know. Just think it's interesting. The Ottoman Empire was maybe more benign because they were really ineffectively run. I don't know. Maybe that's... It's like bad and bad. Which one are you going to choose? Bad and bad.
Yeah.
Languages, Czech versus Serbo-Croat. Which one are you going to choose?
I have absolutely no opinion. What do you choose? Czech or Serbo-Croat?
Serbo-Croat because, it was developed by the two missionaries that went to the Slavs. Oh, what are their names? I'm not going to remember their names. But it's a really cool story.
Okay. So that's, And that's why you choose that language.
Who, when they go to a major cosmopolitan city, says, I hate all these people who are here. It's decadent. I can't who says?
Apparently Hitler. Hitler does.
Maybe you need to think that's a problem instead of being inspired by all the differences and beauty of these different cultures. Yeah.
But I don't think that that's as uncommon a viewpoint as it sounds like you do. I think
I know, sadly.
It can be when you're used to just kind of like one color or a particular way of life, and then you see like the incredible variety. I remember, I don't know if you remember this because you're not an Atlanta Braves baseball fan, but there was a really great pitcher.
Yeah.
A guy named John Rocker who pitched for Atlanta. And he pitched great against the New York Mets, but he made these comments about riding, I think it was the 9 train, and going through all these little ethnic neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And he hated it. He hated it. He was like, just like used to this one very narrow, apparently kind of like way of life. And when he got exposed to all the Puerto Rican neighborhoods and Jewish neighborhoods and black neighborhoods, he could not handle it, and he went public with it. It was, I mean, it was a disaster, a total disaster. So I don't think that's as uncommon.
No, I know.
As you make it sound.
I know, I shouldn't, but I do think it's somewhat personality driven, but also, I don't know. It disturbs me because the beauty of life is the differences, right? But I'm afraid that maybe more people in America feel that way than I think. So
I think so.
Well, Tim.
Emily, we got to wrap up this show.
We do.
Hey, I want to thank Clark Stefanik, our producer, for making us sound so good. Thanks to True North, our platform. So True North is our platform. True North is the podcasting arm of Classical Academic Press. Check out the Chris Perrin Show. That's Perrin, the Chris Perrin Show. He's a leader in the renewal of classical education in the United States for the last 25 years. Our music was written and performed by Tom Hagerman. Emily, we made it through Mein Kampf.
Thank God.
Yeah. Let's go into something a little bit lighter, like warfare in the 20th century in the next episode.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. We'll see you then.